Evening. Welcome to Augustana and welcome to the Swenson Center. My name is Dag Blank. I am the director of the Swedish-American Research Center here at Augustana, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to this year's O. Fritjof Ander Lecture in Immigration History. As many of you know, O. Fritjof Ander was a legendary member of the Augustana faculty and a pioneer in the study of Swedish immigration history. And it is in his honor we have this lecture series. And I have actually lost count now how many we have. I think you might be the 26th or the 27th or something like that.
I'm happy either way.
Either way. I'm glad for that. And I'm very, very happy to have this year's lecturer here, Larsmo from Uppsala in Sweden. Larsmo is one of the leading authors in Sweden today and a public intellectual of some standing. And he has just published, he published a novel in 2016 called Swede Hollow, about a Swedish settlement in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it has just appeared in an English translation under the same title, Swede Hollow. And it is on this topic he will be speaking tonight. Ola is a critic, literary critic, and an author. He writes for the leading Swedish newspaper, Dagens Nyheter. He has been an editor of the literary magazine BLM, and was the president of PEN Sweden, PEN Association, Swedish chapter of PEN, from 2009 to 2017. He has received a number of prizes and awards. I won't go through them all, but the most important, I think, is an honorary degree from Uppsala University. His many novels, I think 9?
This is the 9th.
This is the 9th. They all deal with events in the Swedish past. In fact, most of them, all of them, are based on careful historical research in both archives and the libraries. He often deals with the forgotten, suppressed, or perhaps even painful dimensions of the past. The citation for one of his many literary awards from 2018 speaks about how he writes about the blind spots of history, of Swedish history, the blind spots of Swedish self-understanding even, and the marginalized groups in Swedish society, and the forgotten aspects of Swedish history. Swede Hollow follows that trajectory in that it deals with a significant event in Swedish history, the mass migration of Swedes to the United States at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, focusing then on Swedish immigrants in St. Paul, Minnesota. It is a thoroughly researched book. Ola spent a significant time in the Twin Cities preparing for this book and at the Minnesota Historical Society doing research there. I was with him once on a trip that when you were in the Twin Cities. And I remember from your study in Uppsala, you had this detailed map of St. Paul sitting there on your wall so you could follow your immigrants and your migrants as you wrote about them. And we're very happy that you took time to come here today, and the title of your talk today is Swede Hollow, a different Swedish-American history. Please join me in welcoming Ola.
Thank you very much, Dag, and thank you so much for inviting me here. It's custom to say that you're deeply honored to be a guest at an occasion like this, but I really mean it, believe it or not. I really feel truly honored being here, because this is like a very serious sort of place to be, to talk about these things. I should also say that this is quite scary for me, because some of the people I used as authorities when I wrote this book are present tonight. Dag is one of them, Joy Gentleman up there is another one, so I thank you both for your help in writing this book. And if I get anything wrong, please tell me afterwards. But as Dag said, we did rather careful and intense research for this book. When I say we, I mean me and my wife Rita, who helped me. And the reason that we ended up in Minnesota at all was because Rita One was an exchange student in Minnesota in the 70s. And when we went back there in 2006 to visit her friends, we sort of stumbled into this story. And I hope I don't offend anyone when I say that in 2006, more than 10 years ago now, 10 years before the book was published, the interest in the history of Swedish migration was not at its top, you could say, at least not just there and just then. And I remember, just to give you an example, that we went out to Lindström. Every Swedish tourist that comes to Minnesota must go to Lindström and see the statues, of course, and Christina and so on. And we get back to that. And in Lindström, they have Lindström Bakery. And Lindström Bakery has this fantastic sign outside saying, home of the original Swedish donut. And we went in there and we bought one donut each, ate it, and it was very good. But then I asked the guy behind the counter how come they call it the original Swedish donut, since we don't eat that many donuts in Sweden. And he had to think a little bit, and then he answered, well, you know, I think around here Swedish just means old. That was his explanation. It is not like that, of course. The connections between Sweden and the States are very deep, and they are still strong, I would say. But for a while there, I think we thought it was longer ago than it actually is. And some of these questions concerning Swedish migration to the States has sort of reawakened. It's no mystery why that's happening. In a world where migration again is shaping world politics, of course, we get a renewed interest in our own migration history and what we can learn from it. Perhaps compare now and then, which I will try to do a bit later. But when we visited Minneapolis and St. Paul in 2006, we also went to American Swedish Institute. And in one of the small rooms upstairs in the Turnbell Mansion, there was this the faded exhibition. There were photos pinned to cardboard. There was a small monitor with a small documentary. And I just went in there on chance and looked around a little bit. And when my family came to get me, it's 45 minutes or so later, they almost had to drag me out because I have been absolutely fascinated. And this exhibition was about a place called Swede Hollow. I had never heard about it. It was totally new to me. And I wondered, actually with a feeling of rising anger, why I had never heard about this. Why nobody has told me about this, and why we hadn't ever discussed these people that lived in Swede Hollow, since they were, in my view, and they are today, in my view, important aspects of Swedish and American history. And I hope you will agree with me when we have finished this talk. Now we have been looking at this beautiful map of St. Paul for a while. It's from the 1890s, and you can find it in the Minnesota History Center, their archives. It's a whole book. You can look at the whole of St. Paul this way. And if you look at this map, I think you can learn a lot of things about what kind of city St. Paul was back then in the 1890s. Of course, you can see the Mississippi River at the very bottom. And this place, special bend of the river, I think, was not far from where a lot of the migrants came ashore from the riverboats. St. Anthony's Falls is a little bit upstream, and the riverboats didn't go further in those days. So if you stepped off the boat here and you had no money left, you would probably look around for a place to stay. So some Swedish migrants might not have made it that far from the landing. You can also, of course, see the enormous net of black lines coming in from the left, and that, of course, is the railroad lines. And they formed like a cluster here, and you had the railroad yards here where people went to work. And the one most important of these railroads was the great one owned by James J. Hill. It still is an important name in Minneapolis. And Mr. Hill, who was one of these railroad barons, had a saying about Swedes. He used to say that, give me Swedes, snuff and whiskey, and I will build a railroad through hell. It says something about, well, how he regarded Swedes, I would say. And Rick and I have gone on this railroad from the Pacific and to Minneapolis. And in a way, I think it's correct to say that he actually built the railroad to hell. Because that was dangerous work. I can't confirm this, but I read in a book that once every 10 kilometers or so, you will find an unmarked grave for one of the navvies who built this railroad. Dangerous work out west. And some of these guys were Swedish. I wonder if you have found Swede Hollow on this map. The interesting thing is it's right in the middle and you can't see it, which I think is kind of symbolic. This is Swede Hollow, right next to the single railroad line going north up to Duluth. It is fascinating that you have this community with perhaps 500, 700, some even say 1,000 inhabitants down in this little valley in the middle of the city, and it was not really seen. You can have a hard time finding it today if you don't know what to look for. Since you can't see it from the street, you can see treetops, you can see fences, but you don't know what's there, but you don't know what to look for. If we take the next slide, you can see what it looked like today from space. This green cut through the landscape is Swede Hollow. It is, you must excuse me for using metric here, but it is about 1 kilometer long and 700 meters wide at the widest spot. And this is a glacial rift. It was this glacial river who carved sort of a groove in the landscape going down to what would be Mississippi later on. It is quite steep. The ground is rather damp. And temperature down there is a little milder in the summertime and not so cold in the wintertime. So you can understand why people wanted to build a cabin there. But it's also very damp and it's not a really healthy environment, I would say, to live in. And the first guy who actually built a house here, there might have been some Dakota presence. I think they are looking into archaeological research on this spot. There are a lot of Dakota settlements around. But the first documented name of a person living down here was the Irishman Edward Phelan, who was discharged from Fort Snelling and the US Army in the 1850s. And he built a small cabin here. But Mr. Phelan was a rather troublesome person, so he got involved in a lot of shady business deals and he got accused of a murder. And after a while, he thought it was best to leave for California and got murdered on the way. And that's where he disappears from this story. But he left some traces, and we shall return to that. As you can see, the blocks up to the left in the picture are called Railroad Island. And that was also a Swedish settlement. I would say that the people living in Railroad Island were a little better off than the ones living down in the hollow. They probably, and we know for a fact that they looked down, literally looked down on the people in the hollow and did not want to be associated with them. The people living down there were supposed to be the one at the bottom rung of the society's ladder in so many ways. If we look at this little piece of the first map that you see, you can get a sort of idea what kind of society this was and what place it was. The St. Paul Duluth Railroad line goes through the village. It is divided by 7th Street, and to the south of 7th Street there was an Irish community called Connemara Patch. And north of 7th Street you would find Swedes and after a while Italians and some Polish people. These little yellow dots you can see in the map are shacks. The whole place was not owned but controlled by a person called Wagoner. He used to be a sheriff, and he rented out ground to the people who wanted to build their small shacks down there. He charged about $1.50 every month, which wasn't that much, but the dark side of this was that you had no really ownership of the ground. You had no contracts within contracts. You didn't own the land. You could be evicted at any time, and you didn't own your shack either. But Mr. Wagoner seems to have been rather well considered by the people living there, so I guess there wasn't too much trouble if you just pay your $1.50 every month. But the real problem was the creek, Phelan Creek. And this is also a bit tragic. It's called Phelan after Edward Phelan, so the only trace he leaves in history is to get his name misspelled on a map, which might be a little bitter. But this creek comes from up north in Phelan Lake, and about this time, this part of St. Paul had no modern sewer system, so the people living upstream just chucked everything they wanted to get rid of into the creek, and then it ran down to the Swedes, who out here also continued to pour everything they wanted to get rid of in the creek, and then it ran down to the Irish down here, and then out into the Mississippi. So Phelan Creek was rather contaminated. And if you read the newspapers, you can see that the authorities of the time, say late 19th century, have a running discussion about how unsanitary this place is and how it is actually a place where a lot of diseases could find foothold and spread up into the rest of St. Paul. So it is really considered a really bad place. And every spring there was a flood, and then there were puddles standing everywhere in this rather damp milieu. And after a while, when the heat came, the flies started to come out. And if you were unlucky, in a few weeks, the diseases would come. It would be diseases like diphtheria or perhaps illness that we don't consider so serious today, like whooping cough. But the infant mortality was rather high down here. A little bit up on the street, you can find the first Lutheran church in St. Paul, then called First Swedish Lutheran. And their church archives are still there in Swedish. And if you go through them, it's quite depressing to read them, because you find a lot of names of rather small children with typical Swedish names, like Stina or Anders, who never lived to be more 3 or 4 years old. So it is rather a bleak spot, you can say. I don't want to call it a slum, because I think the people who live there wouldn't want us to talk about this as a slum. This was their home. But infant mortality was high, as I said. You can see that a lot of the men died or were really badly injured in railroad accidents, since they were working at the railroad. So you couldn't expect to live for that long. And the dream of most of these people were, of course, to get, as they said, up on the street. And it's strange to imagine, when you visit this place today, when it is a park, that this was the home of 500 to 1,000 people who were literally living below the surface of society as a whole. And we should just say a few words about who the immigrants were. And this is a tricky subject in this special congregation, I think, because I have gleaned all my facts from people like you. Anyway, we talked about this a little bit earlier today, that there were perhaps as many as 1.3 million immigrants leaving Sweden during the heyday of immigration from 1850 to World War I. Let's say that at least 1 million of these stayed on in the States. That means that you have 1 million different stories to listen to. I think we only heard a very small number of those stories being told, even though there have been a lot of research carried out. And of course, as you know, in Sweden, the image of migration is shaped by the novels of Wilhelm Moberg. How many here have read Anton Gundan? Yeah, quite a few. As you know, these books are still being reprinted in new editions all the time. And I would say that they have had the impact on the readership in Sweden that they have almost replaced the historical facts. And I don't mention this to criticize Wilhelm Moberg, which I think is a great writer. His books, especially the Immigrant Swede, is always in competitions and lists of the best books written in the 20th century. They always come up as number 1. So they are truly great fiction. But I think there is something a bit strange with how we have handled his stories. Those of you that have read this week know that they are about quite a few immigrants with very different backgrounds and different faiths here in the States. But we tend to focus on the main characters of Karl-Oskar and Justina, the farmer couple who live in Småland in the 1850s to start a new farm in Minnesota. And in many ways that is the picture that the reading public and the general public in Sweden has of the immigration to the United States. They were small farmers, they had hard times, but they succeeded and created their farm or the shop or what it was. And that story is true, but it is not the only story. And Vilhelm Moberg, in writing his books, really wanted us to listen to other aspects of Swedish immigration as well. In his book, besides Karl-Oskar and Justina, you find characters like Uncle Daniel, who is a religious dissenter. He has to leave Sweden because his type of faith doesn't match the Swedish church at the time. You have the psychologically most interesting person in the novel, that is Ulrika, who goes from being a despised prostitute in her home village to becoming a prosperous pastor's wife in the States, which must have felt good, I think. And you also have, of course, the characters of Robert and Arvid, who are the young boys who really doesn't make it in a new country. They die quite tragically in different ways. So I think Moberg, in including characters like Robert and Arvid and making them an important part of the narrative, wants us to understand that there were several very different faiths even among the early immigrants to the States. And for some obscure reason, perhaps not so obscure, we have sorted out the other characters when we wanted to create symbols of Swedish migration. We only remember Karl-Oskar and Justina because we want to listen to the story about success, which is an encouraging story, but it is not the only story. I spoke to a tourist guide up in Lindström, where this museum of Moberg novels is Nya Duvemåla, which is a fiction in itself. It's a house that has been moved there and make it look a little bit like the house that inspired Moberg. And this tourist guide said that it is not uncommon to meet Swedish tourists who come there who want to see the grave of Karl-Oskar and Justina. And he then very sort of carefully asked them, do you know that they are characters in a novel? And people say, yeah, but we still want to see the grave. They have this sort of abandoned little grave in the cemetery company and say perhaps they might be lying. which says something, of course, of the power of fiction in many ways. But Vilhelm Moberg, I think, wants to write about the true pioneers, that were the kind of people who interested him and inspired him. That is, the people who had the courage to do this for the first time, so the first ones to do it, and sort of paved the way for the people who came after them. That was the kind of people that really, truly inspired him. But we all know that most of the immigrants leaving Sweden were not small farmers from Småland. Those who came later in the 80s and 90s were, in many cases, working class people or servants from the countryside. If you left a city from an urban area, you often ended up in a city or urban area, like the slaughterhouses in Chicago or the steel mills in Gary, or for that part in the flour mills of Minneapolis, or railroads, railyards in Minneapolis. I have chosen this picture of these girls as representatives for the Swedish migrants, not just because that's the ones you meet in the museum in Ellis Island representing Sweden, but because of Joy's book, actually. Joy Lintemann wrote the book I Go to America, that is a very interesting picture of female immigration to the States. And if I'm not wrong now, correct me if I'm wrong, Joy, but during a few years in the 1880s, there was a sort of all-time high for young women who immigrated, so much that it actually concerned the authorities one point. And I think that it's only true to say that these girls had discovered something that was important, came to be very, very important for Sweden as a country. They had discovered that in the United States you could work for yourself, you could have a salary, you could be independent, you didn't have to marry if you didn't want to. You could actually be a professional and shape your own life. And the character, the person, real person that Joy writes about, Lina Andersson, actually lived in Rhode Island for a few years, I think, far from the Hollow. And she writes this interesting letter home to her friends in Sweden. And she says, and I can't quote directly from Joy's book, she says something along the lines of, at home I was a servant in the countryside. I worked for boarding, house and boarding. I had no regulated hours, and I walked around wearing a shawl. Here in the States, I am a Swedish maid. I have a room of my own, I have a salary, and I go around wearing a hat. And that hat, I think, is extremely important in this context. If you have photographs like that of female relatives that sent a picture home to Sweden, wearing a huge big hat, that hat was a symbol of the fact that you're made it. It's actually a symbol of freedom. So, and I think this idea of being able to create your own life independent of your husband is an idea that traveled on the backs of immigrants back to Sweden and actually reinforced the Swedish women's liberation movement. And that is one of the really interesting things you can see when it comes to this late phase of the migration, how many ideas about society that travels back to Sweden on the backs of immigrants. And I would say that they were extremely important, not just for the temperance movement and the free church movement, which we already know, but also for the women's liberation movement and even the workers' movement, an exchange of ideas back and forth. And that is also a very important part of Swedish migration. Some of you might have seen this photo. It's of well-known photos from Sweden Hollow. And down here you can see one of the Swedish contribution to American culture. That is outhouses and stilts built out over Fea Creek. An early attempt at water closets. And down here in this house with the little fence and the fruit trees, there lived an Italian family called Sancelli. And now I think this picture is taken some years into the 20th century. Mike Sancelli, who lived in that house as a boy, was one of the two people actually who has left written accounts about their life and upbringing. Mike Sancelli wrote a short piece that was published by Minnesota Historical Society about how it was to grow up in the Hollow of the early 20th century. And he thought he had a good time. He was very grateful towards his parents. They gave him a good childhood, even though they were very poor. And he describes a rather paradise sort of place where he played with his friends and everything was rather okay. He also says something that I find a little bit controversial. He says that by the year of 1910, almost all the Swedes had left the Hollow. There was just one lady living, and there couldn't speak Italian, otherwise we wrote Italian. And it's easy to believe in, because it fits into the narrative of what successful Swedes who got out of the Sweden Hollow. But if you look at the documentation, I don't think that checks out. I think Mike Sancelli's perspective is the perspective of the child, and it was written down a long time after he actually had left the Hollow himself. We'll get back to that, but there is one more written narrative about Sweden Hollow, and that is actually by a Swedish writer. His name was Nils Håkansson, and I think that some of you have read this little text in the Minnesota History Society, where he talks a bit about his upbringing in the Hollow. And he's quite grateful too to his parents for making the best they could for him when he was a boy. He doesn't speak any Swedish though. He has forgotten all Swedish with one exception. There is one phrase he can say in Swedish, and that is "förbannade irländare." That is those damnable Irish. Because that was something that his father used to say quite a lot. So that stuck. But otherwise, all traces of the Swedish language have left him. As I said, he is rather grateful to his parents as well, but there is one little story in his narrative that sort of sticks out. And it is one of the really terrible moments in his life. He would carry this with him as long as he lived. How he comes out one morning and sees his father building a coffin for his little brother who died in the night, probably from diphtheria. And he thought, how can my brother fit into that small box? Because people actually get smaller when they die. So that was like the horrible moment in his life. But these are the two testimonies we have that I know of at least. I spoke to Professor David Larsmo at Augustana College in Singapore. And when he was a young researcher, he had interviewed some of the Swedes who had grown up in the hollow. And he said that for the first hour you talk to them, they would also sound a bit like Mike and Shelley, and just remembering the good times. But after 1 more hour or so, when they have come to trust this young researcher, other aspects of life in the hollow started to surface, and they started to talk about alcoholism, for instance, about others being killed, working for the railroad, about young siblings who had died in different forms of disease. So that's a more complex and perhaps darker aspect of the picture of life in the hollow that emerges. But that's what we have when it comes to testimonies from people who actually live there. If we want to get closer to these people, we have to look at documents like this. And most of you, of course, recognize this as a census record. I think this one is from the year 1900. And of course, they are all available on microfilm in the Minnesota History Society. But they're also quite difficult to read, especially if you want to find the people in the hollows. Because, as you could see from the first map, Swede Hollow really didn't exist in the official records. Actually, I think they split the census wards in two here, Swede Hollow in the middle, because that wasn't really an acknowledged place. But with the help of very, very kind and knowledgeable archivists at the Gay Library in Minnesota, we went through these census records and managed to piece together what we could about the people in the hollow, because the address that they gave was not hollow or even a street name, because there were no streets in the hollow. They just named their houses after the creeks, so we lived on Failing Creek 1 and Failing Creek 2, and so on. So if we piece this together, and I also transcribed this, I have in my computer at home rather large part of the 1900 and 1910 census in St. Paul. And you can see that, I would say that there is about 700 names that sound Swedish, or people who have given their birthplace as Sweden in these census records. And if you have a name like Inger Nilsson or Sven Andersson, and you gave your birthplace as Sweden, it's easy to understand that it's hard to trace these people back to Sweden to have some lists and church records and so on, because they are so ordinary names. So that's tough. I found really 2 or 3 persons who has given their birthplaces in Sweden in the church records of First Lutheran Church, and they come from as the worst places as Sundsvall or Ystad in Sweden. There's also a rather large population coming from a very small village of Larsmo in Västergötland, so I am hoping about that when it has Larsmo. But even if this document is sort of sketchy, there's some things you can learn from it. And the men almost always give their profession as laborer, just laborer. And that often, very often meant that they went to the railroads every morning to apply for a job as a day laborer that day. You could make about $1, I think, as a regular salary. That actually was lower as we get further into the 20th century. And it was dangerous work. They worked often as, for instance, as brakemen, And in every audience, there's always a few experts on railroading. I don't think this audience is an exception. So then you know what a brakeman did. We didn't have modern brakes on the trains by this time. It was done manually, and that meant that you had to hang out into the wind or even stand on the roof of a railroad car and braking when the guy at the engine gave the signal. That meant standing perhaps on a railroad car going very fast over the prairie into the wind in perhaps minus 20 centigrade. And it's very easy for these guys to fall between railroad cars and be maimed or getting crushed. And there are numerous examples of that. The women who give any sort of indication that they were working outside their own home sometimes, or rather often, say that they were seamstresses. And seamstress could mean a lot of things. It could mean that you worked at a rather decent factory like the one I'm trying to write about in my normal. It could also mean that you were sitting in a basement somewhere without ventilation and sewing sacks for the flour mills in Minneapolis. And that meant that you were sitting in a confined space with a lot of textile fibers in the air. And in not so many years from that moment, you might die from tuberculosis. So it was dangerous, unhealthy work, whether you were a man or a woman. There are some examples in this list of people that have sort of managed to get some other type of profession, like we have a boiler mechanic at the Lund Railroad. We also have a bottler at the brewery. So these guys were possibly on their way up on the street, as they used to say. Perhaps they soon would live up on in Railroad Island, for instance. But the idea, the pattern that emerges from these census records is that if you came to the hollow, you'd probably live out your life in the hollow. And the next generation might get out of there. If you look after the names of the children, you see that it says generally at school. So they definitely sent the children to school. It was a good school in the neighborhood. And with the help of learning the English language, it looks like the children were the ones who got up on the street, whereas their parents probably stayed in the hollow. And this is a subject that people in Sweden can't get enough of. I have given this lecture a number of times in Swedish, and when we reach this point, it's nice interest, shall we say. This is namely about the prejudice that Swedes faced in the 1880s. This is a newspaper cutting from the newspaper called David Globe. And this journalist is going to write a slum piece. He's going to slum it. He's going down into the hollow. He's standing at the top of the stairs, and he wonders whether he really dares to go down into this, he says, because this primitive remnant of the agrarian Swedish countryside in the middle of the modern industrial city of St. Paul. And finally, he dares to go down there, and he meets children playing in the mud, wearing strange homemade patched up clothes, talking an intelligent language. They always make fun of the way how Swedes speak the English language. And everybody he meets is very, very suspicious and thinks that he's there to cheat them away from their little houses. But he ends his piece quite hopefully, the line, "They are poor, but they are happy." A little later, a few years later, there's another piece in the same newspaper talking about, again, what's going on in Swede Hollow. And this journalist is even more critical or is more full of prejudice about the Swedes living in Swede Hollow. He says, and I think I quote correctly, he says that the people living here are so poor and so criminal that they don't even send their children to school. They force them up on the street to beg and to steal. And the faces of these children are often disfigured by the kind of leprosy that is a result of the sinful lusts of their parents. And the last wording, the reference to this leprosy, is probably, it probably means inherited syphilis. which I think is something it just makes up. I haven't found any cases of syphilis, documented cases of syphilis down in the Holland. But it really paints a very dark picture of the people living there. If you then continue to read St. Paul Daily Globe, which you can do on the web, it's digitized, you will see that 10 years later or so, you get the 90s, they will start to sound a little bit positive about Swedes. They say, okay, they can't speak English, they're terrible in language. They're probably a little bit stupid, but you can hire them. They are rather reliable workers, so it's not a mistake to hire a Swede. These Italian guys, though, on the other hand, who are starting to appear in great numbers now, they are dangerous, they fight with knives, they are organized criminality, so stay away from the Italians. And when you got a little bit into the 20th century and the family of Sancelli, for instance, in the Hollow, they start to sound a little bit nicer towards the Italians. And they say, well, the Italians, they are the way they are, but we have to consider the fact that they are descendants of the Roman Empire, and they make very, very good food. These Polish guys, on the other hand, who are starting to appear, and so on. So it's like watching a huge big machine where you put people in at the bottom level, and there they have to stand and be despised and ridiculed until somebody else appears and is pushed in beneath them. That means that it was not much. And then somebody else arrives and is put in second bunch of people, and not two bunches. And we all know that when we reach the 1920s, the Scandinavian immigrants are seen as the desired immigrants, the ones that it's really want to see. And this machine that I mentioned, of course, we know that it's still there, it's still at work, you recognize it, you don't have to push that point. And if you go to Minneapolis today, which Augustana visited, for instance, the Swiss Boulevard, the Swedish streets, that's now the homes of the Somali community. And the American Swedish Institute, I think, have a good cooperation with the Somali community, sharing their experiences of being immigrants. When I wrote the first piece about Sweden Hollow in my newspaper, I quoted Bill Bayer, a member of American Swedish Institute in Minneapolis, told me a little story about how there had been a midsummer celebration at the American Swedish Institute that had gotten a little bit lively and perhaps a little bit out of hand, and they had been singing Små Grodarna a little bit too loudly. So on his way home, he stopped by in the Somali neighborhood around the American Swedish Institute and asked whether they had been noisy. And he started to explain to the guy sitting outside on the stairs that this was the Swedish midsummer celebration and so on. And the guy interrupted him and said, well, no, it didn't bother me at all. You know, my brother and my father, they both live in Stockholm, so this felt like being at home. We see these kind of connections all the time. And this little map I just want to show you because it says something about how close you actually can get to these people with what you can call traditional historical research. In this map you can see numbers on the houses, for instance number 18 up there. And we took this map with us to Bethesda Hospital in St. Paul. That is a church run by the Baptist Church, and where poor people could get free health care even back at the end of the 19th century. And in house number 18, in the 1900s, there lived a boy named Peter Eriksson. And Peter suffered from something called mastoiditis, which I have learned since then is a very painful infection of the inner ear. And in Peter's temporary at the hospital, it said there was complications with gangrene. And that probably means that his condition was lethal people. But down here, in this little house in the 30s, there lived a girl named Stina Andersson. And Stina was suffering from anemia, which is something they could treat back in those days. So with the right medication and the right diet, they could discharge her and she would have to So my point is, you can take this map with you down into the hollow and you can find the spot where house number 18 was. And you can stand there and you can actually imagine that 190 years ago there was a boy named Peter who lived on this very spot, who had terrible pains in his head. And then I think a sort of shaft opens down into history, and I think we can sort of get very close to them. But if you want to get even further, if you want to get even closer to these people, you have to use other tools than traditional historical research, which I have tried to do. You have to use the tools of imagination, empathy, fiction, and you leave empirical studies behind. You use the other tools that we always have used to understand lives very different from our own. We've always done that. We've always told stories of other people as a way of understanding other people's lives are as real and as important as my own. You have seen this picture before, but if you try to keep it in your mind's eye, I will take you a time trip right now. I think this is the same spot today. And if you go down into the hollow today, you will meet this, a rather unkept forest and lawns and deer grazing, which we saw just the other day when we were there. And if you didn't know what kind of place it was, you could probably imagine that this was a piece of forest that somebody had kept out of nostalgic reason, or just want to have a green spot in the new city. So to imagine that this was a society where perhaps as many as 700 to 1,000 people lived is almost impossible today. Which says something what happened when we turn our backs on nature, we claim all of it, which is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. If you know where to look, you can find remnants of houses in the forest. You can find pieces of pottery in the ground if you go down. But the stories are gone. The knowledge we have of these people who live here is almost gone. And this is how it ends. Some of you might know this already, but in 1956, when you read the newspapers from 1956, you can see that the authorities have discovered, they actually used the word discovered, that people are still living in the hollow. Then we are talking about 50 Mexicans who lived there, and they were quite forcibly evicted and just chucked out of the valley and moved somewhere else to live. And they sent down the St. Paul Fire Brigade to torch the houses because nobody was supposed to live there anymore. Phelan Creek had been covered over, but it was still considered a health risk. The water is quite smelling today as well. And everything burns. And as you can see, what is burning here is the family Sanchelis and the nice cottage with the fence and 2 trees. And once they had turned the whole community to ash, nothing much happened. We're talk of building industrial lots here, we're talk of this and that, but people started to chuck garbage here, there was some drug trafficking, and in around 1970, people in the neighborhood said, enough is enough, we can't have it like this, and St. Paul City turned it into a park, which it is today. And these are the railroad arches at the very bottom of the hollow. Use your imagination here and go back to the year 1900 and imagine hundreds of men in blue and gray jackets at dawn on their way to the railroads of Mr. Hill and other railroad companies, asking for one day's work and $1 for their families. I think it's over to them to try to reimagine the lives they led. When we visited the valley here in 2017, it was winter. A small group went down to the hollow, and with us we had the St. Paul musician and composer Ann Milligan. And Ann Milligan had composed an opera in 2012, which I didn't know, and she didn't know that I had written a novel. So we had a lot of stuff to discuss. So much I think that before the rest of the company. So when I looked up, we noticed that we were standing alone down here in this very spot. And Anne said, listen to the silence. It was true. Up there on the arches, 7 street lights with 4-lane traffic. But that day it was quiet. We stood there and listened to the silence, And after a while, a wind came through the bushes, and it sounded a bit like whispering. And when I listened a little longer, I was quite sure that they were whispering in Swedish. And that's the point I want to leave you with. Vilhelm Moberg wrote his books about his immigrants as fiction. He didn't write a dissertation, he didn't write an essay. He wanted to get as close to these people as possible. And I think that are the tools that we have to use to really understand the difference between our lives now and their lives then. We almost have a responsibility to use our imagination to get as close as their reality as possible. As we can. And the thing is, I can't as a writer really tell whether I have succeeded or not. That, my friends, is up to you. So if you want to read this novel, you have to tell me afterwards if you think that these people came alive or not. But I can assure you that I did my best with as much respect as possible for these people. And that is one of my final words. This is where I leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ola, for bringing the lives of these people closer to us here tonight, which you did very well, and also for sharing your techniques, the way you work. And I've seen you in action, and you work as an historian, but you also go beyond what we as historians do, and you do it eminently well, as we can see in the book. Are there questions, comments? I'm sure Ola would like to engage with you. Yes, Lily Sepidol.
Ola, since I write historical fiction myself, I know that you have to make up the characters. And how many characters do you make up? And how much is true that you write about the characters?
Oh, the question of truth. The question that Pilate asked Christ. That's a tricky one. There is actually one character in the book that I have not made up. And I won't really talk too much about the plot or what happens because that would give away some of the story. But there is one poor boy named Carl Hammerbergs who existed for real, and he was involved in the lynchings in Duluth in the 1920s when 3 black guys were murdered, and he was sent to prison for it. That story is real. I was so shocked by the court transcript in that case, where you could read that say things like Nilsson held the guy, whereas Pettersson put the noose around his head, and Constable Olsson tried to stop them. You realized there were lots of Swedes involved in this. And I really wanted to bring that story to the Swedish audience that we should be aware of this and also see it as part of the Swedish history. So his story is
Question. Didn't you feel sorry for these people?
not really.
Because you live in Sweden, so you don't have to feel sorry.
Well, I live in Sweden now. I had lived in Sweden then, I might have felt sorry for myself. No, but
I used to live in Greenland, Ohio, and we had a Swedish army there too. And when I heard about those people, I got so sorry for them. So I could never write about it. It would be too long. So I think you need a distance to do that.
to be quite honest, I think it's one job of literature to go into the really dark places.
It's just a job.
Yeah, what do you call it? Calling, mission, whatever. It's what we're supposed to do.
Very interesting.
Yes, of course.
This question may be out of your territory.
Sorry.
Mid-20th century, Minneapolis became known as the Swedish place, and St. Paul, the Irish place. My question is, do you know anything about how the Swedish population grew in St. Paul to become a large population, or did the Irish take over?
I might have to redirect that question to Joy, actually.
Well, they moved up and out of the Howell, they moved Queen Avenue, and then they moved more farther out into the suburbs, and I'm trying to think of what the names of the suburbs that would be. Yeah, maybe Charlotte, and they, as their lives improved, they left the center of the city. So, that's,
Large numbers, or did all the large numbers of people go to Minneapolis and Boston? Just a curiosity.
Actually, one of the interesting things about the Hollow as a micro version of St. Paul is the fact that Swedes and Irish live there. The history of the Irish in the Hollow is very interesting. They were actually poor fishermen from Connemara who has been transplanted to the prairie, where they were supposed to create a sort of utopian agrarian society under the leadership, distant leadership of Bishop Ireland in St. Paul. And they failed miserably and drifted back to the city and ended up even sort of below the poor Swedes in the structure of society. This one interesting book about this written by a lady called Bridget Connolly. The title of the book is Forgetting Ireland. But I think you're right in that St. Paul was even more working class than Minneapolis. It was more Catholic than Protestant compared to Minneapolis, and dominated by Irish in another way from Minneapolis. But I'm not a local historian, so I have to leave that to the people who actually know their stuff.
If I may make an observation about the Swedish and the Irish, we're still waiting to see a big, interesting book about the relationship between the Swedes and the Irish, because they coexist in so many places. Of course, the Irish are almost everywhere in American urban settings, but where there were Swedes, there were also Irish. Chicago would be a fantastic place to study the interaction between the Swedes and the Irish. You can do it in the Twin Cities, you can do it in other urban locations too. And they live close to each other, they compete with each other for space, in the social fabric, for jobs, and so forth. They, religious dissent, the anti-Catholicism, the Swedes very quickly become part of the general anti-Catholic movement in the United States. Yet there's also very little interaction. You look at intermarriage figures, Swedes and Irish do tend to intermarry. So it's a very interesting relationship of two groups that we still are waiting for a good study of, I think. But it's no coincidence that you find it in St. Paul, probably also in Minneapolis, and certainly in Chicago. Yes.
Since I know Ireland myself, I wanted them to be friends, but that wasn't really the case.
It is hard to find friendships there, yes.
I think you should say some words about how people react, you know, in Sweden.
Okay, that's a special case. This novel, it might sound like bragging, but it sold very well. It got very good reviews, and there's even a restaurant named Swede Hollow again in Stockholm these days. I don't even think about what kind of food they would serve. But when I first wrote a piece about this in Augustana, I got an enormous reaction from interested readers. And most of them were very positive, to hear more, but there were also some very critical reactions, and these came from people on the right-wing flank of Swedish politics. And one guy wrote to me and said, "You are blackening the memory of Karl-Oskar and Kristina." I wrote back to him and said, "You know these are characters from the novel, right?" He never answered me. Then I got another letter from another guy saying, "I see that you have collected all your hatred for Sweden in a book." Then I wrote back to him and said, "Have you read the book?" And he answered, "I wouldn't dream." So I'm just mentioning this to point out that Dag and I have discussing this as well. But there is an image of the Swedish immigrant, the States as the ideal immigrant who has never failed always succeeded with whatever they undertook. And we have sort of edited people out of this picture. These people, for instance. But if you try to discuss this, especially if you try to discuss this white people on the right-wing flank of history, they will think that it's an argument to sort of bring Swedes down to the same level as other people. And you can't do that if you are the right-wing flank Swedish political spectrum. So yes, some people got really angry. I'm not so sure I'm sad about that.
But it is also if I may say, an interesting observation that you told me that this is the book of your books that has been best-selling.
Oh yes.
And the enormous interest in this novel as a theater play
Yeah.
made of it, and there's probably a TV series in the comings.
Very hard talks.
Yeah, and now there's a translation to English. It shows how this theme still resonates in Sweden. It shows how relevant the story of the migration to the United States is, or these stories, as you point out, that there's so many stories. It's still, after all these years, and the migration ended in the 1920s, and it's almost, a century later, this is still a very, very relevant topic in Sweden. Partly because of all the family connections, partly because of the very heavy out-migration, the intricate networks that were created across the Atlantic are still, in some sense, functioning, still operative, and a book like this will reactivate.
I would go as far as to say that it is growing again. I mean, I can't really talk about what the situation is like here in the States, but in Sweden I would say it's definitely a real interest in Swedish migration to the States. And again, it's no mystery because migration is a hot topic.
Right. Hello.
I'm curious what, so it's been turned into a park today. First of all, are Swedes now traveling to see this place, like they're traveling to Lindstrom and other sites? And secondly, now that there's an English translation, and there might be interest from people in St. Paul in this place,
Yeah.
what would you like to see happen to it so that its memories preserved?
Actually, we come from the Twin Cities right now, and I must say the reception there was fantastic. They were so interested and enthusiastic that it wasn't really good for my narcissistic ego. But I would say the interest is growing in St. Paul, rather much so. I think you mentioned, though, that there actually is a bus tour. American citizens out there. There's been a play staged in the Hollow, America's opera has been staged in the Hollow. Just the other day we took part of a walking tour on the east side of St. Paul. Some people mean that they have rediscovered a building that actually stood down in the Hollow and was transplanted out on the street. And some people want to bring it down into the Hollow again, and perhaps make it into a Swedish museum, which I think would be great actually. If it's doable, I can't say, but I would love that. And people from Sweden actually send me little pictures in emails and on Facebook of, we were in St. Paul and I read the book, so we had to go down in the Hollow, and then you see mom and dad smiling in Swede Hollow and 3 extremely bored kids. So yeah, there is that kind of interest. How far it will lead, I can't say, but it is there right now.
I think one can say that, as you suggest here, Swedish visitors to Minnesota, Swedes who come to Minnesota, many will go out to the Moberg land out in Lindstrom and Chisago County. It's been always a destination, but my friends in Minneapolis tell me now, and their Swedish friends come visit, they also want to go to Swede Hollow. How can I get to Swede Hollow? So you have created another place, you have included another place on the Swedish-American itinerary, if you like. And I'm sure there will be people asking, is this where Gustav and Anna Klar lived? And there will be a guide in a few years saying, you know that these are actually characters in a novel. They were real people.
I would love that.
Yes, I'm sure. Yes, Wendy.
Not to give any of the
plot away, but one of your characters is coming not necessarily for opportunity, but to flee Sweden, given some things that he'd been involved in. Was that inspired by historical research, or is that an imagination? I think we think of Swedes as coming for opportunity rather than fleeing from their individual past.
I think we should think of it like this, that there were 1 million at least immigrants from Sweden to the United States. And that means we have 1 million stories. 1 million stories. And of course, they have all kinds of reasons to leave Sweden. Some of them left for economic reasons, others for religious, and some certainly ran away from a troublesome marriage or a crime they had committed or whatever. So yes, I think just as Moberg tried to sort of create a lot of reasons for his immigrants to leave in the 1850s, they tried to construct different reasons for people to leave. Somebody leaves because he's looking for his old lover that come to the United States. Some might run away from a crime they've committed, and one family actually leaves because they have a daughter who is suffering from, what you should say, it's an old word, mental impairment would be a Swedish word. You just want to leave Sweden because they feel that they have in the stamp with her. They want to even heard of it actually, suffer away from crying eyes. So I try to think of very different reasons to leave, yes. And it is fiction.
Yes.
I'd actually like to build on that a little bit more over the fact of your character who goes and follows his lover to Sweden Hollow, and then only to have her leave. Does that represent the false hope of coming to Sweden Hollow from immigrating from Sweden to the States?
I don't want to tell everyone here how the novel ends, but that's a particular love story that you refer to. Turns out to be actually the one that leads this group together, actually brings them to the hollow. We didn't know that, but we were following in the wake of this man who was obsessed, you could say, by this girl and married her, so to speak. So I didn't think of it as an allegory or a symbolic happening in any way, but it does refer to a real case, actually, that ended just as tragically. And that has been written about by Roger McKnight in a book called Severed Ties, Untold Stories, I think it's called. So there is, that case has a sort of, well, it's not the version, not the true version, but it's inspired by McKnight's book, and I certainly think that we're going to use it. So that kind of thing happened, we could say that.
Thank you.
Yes, Mark.
Just a question about the railroad. The railroad played such kind of a romantic role in the history of the American West, and the railroad is central in this novel of why people are here and a lot of the men are working. You mentioned all the graves along the tracks. How has your perspective on the railroad changed in researching this novel, and how do you understand kind of that role in an American city, in the history of the American city, differently?
It's always very scary to go into these kind of fields where you know you have like 1 million people who are fanatics and know everything down to every little bolt on an engine. So that was scary too. I spoke to some railroad people in St. Paul. I read a lot of old railroad magazines, and I tried to really imagine how it would be to work in a place like that. Yeah. That being said, I think I just want to add that from a Swedish perspective, the railroad has always been the symbol of progress, at least in Swedish literature. You could name a number of classics in Swedish literature that actually deal with the railroad, as knitting the land together, forming a nation out of villages, and so on. So it felt quite interesting to take that story of Americans again, because if you read it very closely, and again I shouldn't talk about the plot really, if you read it closely, you see that the guys working at the railroad is being dragged into all kind of political arguments. Their wages are being lowered, there are strikes, there's a permanent strike, for instance. Names like Sacco Valsetti and Joanne are mentioned at the end of the novel. So, in a way, the railroad connects people and brings them into the future here too. But that's the kind of thing that a writer loses himself when he writes. Not certain that it's just useful for the reader. But it's there. I really gave it some thought when I wrote it.
Any more comments or questions? If not, we thank you again, Ola, and outside here we have some punch and cookies and also an opportunity to buy Swede Hollow and get it signed by the author, if you like. So I wish you all welcome back in a year's time to the next annual lecture in immigration history. It's going to be hard to top this one. So thank you again very much.